Hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message this week. I'm kind of on the backside of a quite mild case of COVID and looking forward to being in worship on Sunday, provided that I'm still feeling good enough by then. We are a month into our look at the life of Joseph. Joseph, family forgiveness and redemption has been the title that I've given to this series of messages. We're going to jump right into actually the same story that we looked at last week, Genesis chapter 39. And we're going to look at all 23 verses again today. All right, so let me get reading right away here. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." And she kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. So last week, as we were looking at this message, we focused on the reality that in verses 2 and 3, as well as verses 21 and 23, the narrative tells us that God was with Joseph, that the Lord's presence was with Joseph, both as a slave in a house, but then as well as a prisoner in a jail. And we're gonna revisit this story today because there are a few more truths and principles to be found that are so practical for our lives, related to this reality of the presence of the Lord with us in challenging times. And so this is the first one that I want to share with you, and that is this. The presence of God does not put us out of temptation's reach. You know, in heaven, we're going to be freed from the presence of sin and the presence of temptation as well. But that's not true on this earth, no matter how closely we walk with our God. In fact, I think the text indicates to us that Satan often ramps up the temptation in our lives the more that we cultivate the presence of God. It's clear from this story. In verse 5, it tells us that God blessed the entire household because of Joseph. Well, who's affected by that? I could argue that even more so than Potiphar himself, it's his wife that's affected by how that household being blessed. Potiphar's responsibilities ultimately were at his workplace. And traditionally would be the woman who would have had responsibilities to make sure that the home is cared for. Now clearly they had a bunch of servants to be able to take care of those responsibilities there. But Potiphar's wife clearly benefits from the blessings of God on Joseph's life. And as she is appreciating the peace and the balance and the orderliness that comes along with Joseph's faithfulness to the family, she gets attracted to that. And then she seduces him. And in verse 8, when it says, but he refused, the sense is something along the line that he utterly refuses, like total and absolute refusal, because he found it distasteful, was one word that can be associated with that word for refuse. Just absolutely saying no way because of how horrible and repugnant this thought is. I think most of you know me well enough to know that I like a good joke from time to time. I've been a tease pretty much most of my life, and I have loved to do that periodically with our dogs as well. So there several times with all of our dogs over the years that something is dropped on the kitchen floor, and instead of picking it up, the dog will be attracted over to it and all, and I won't pick it up, but I'll encourage the dog to get it. Like the other day, there was a grape that fell on the floor, and our dog Lincoln was right there, and I said, eat it, Lincoln, eat it, eat it, eat it. And I was all excited for him. He's wagging his tail, and he tastes this grape, and it's like, that doesn't taste all that great. But he ended up swallowing it, largely because of how enthusiastic I was about it. The reality is, if there's more than one dog, they're more likely to eat something. I think a dog would eat a cell phone if it meant that the other dog couldn't get the cell phone. All right? But all of our dogs, no matter how much I have egged them on, they have all drawn the line at anything that is of a citrus nature. Oranges, clementines, it's just they taste that acid in their mouths and they want nothing to do with it, all right? Which is why no company makes dog foods where like the primary ingredient in it is grapefruit. Or no matter how enthusiastic I have been with our dogs, an orange slice is beyond the limits. It is just far too distasteful for them. They totally refuse. They'll sniff at it, nah, I'm not even gonna put that in my mouth. Remarkably, Joseph finds this temptation distasteful. Which, imagine the scenario, okay? So he was ripped away from his family when he was 17 years old. Commentators and authors seem to think that he's probably in his 20s, probably his late 20s when this episode is taking place. He is hundreds of miles removed from his family, who he hasn't seen in several years. He's still a single man. He is in the prime of his life. He is living in the territory of a different territorial god, at least based on the belief system in that whole region around that time frame. And there are multiple reasons why he could so very easily rationalize giving in to her seduction. But he finds her distasteful. Which leads to a second principle here that's I think closely tied to the first one, and that is this. The presence of God allows us to be in situations where temptation comes, but the presence of God also allows us to see sin comprehensively. You know, like a dad who might be at the beach with kids at the ocean or something like that, and the dad has a trained eye for what can be seen out in the water, and he sees maybe a dolphin that's swimming off 50 yards offshore or whatever, and the dad oftentimes will help that child look over there. Can you see that? Every so often, there it goes again, and the dolphin will surface and all, and a father will be able to point that out to a son because a father's eyes can see it more clearly, more comprehensively. I think that's kind of the idea here that takes place, all right? The closer that we walk with God, the more that we're able to see sin the way that God sees sin. See it from a comprehensive standpoint. And when we do that, we are likely to categorically refuse temptations because we see how genuinely distasteful and destructive they are for our personal lives as well as for our relationships with others and with God. When we live our lives, though, with just a casual approach about the presence of God, Satan finds it way easier to with us to compartmentalize sin in our minds. And so we short-sightedly see only its upfront pleasure and never its long-term damage or pain. So, a student could cheat on exams, and when they do so, it provides the instant relief of, I didn't study enough, I don't want to get a bad grade, mom and dad are going to be upset with me and all. They get instant relief by getting a better grade on their test, but it could leave them woefully unprepared for further tests down the road, or unprepared for challenges that they would face in a future job. Gossip might make us feel good about how the office people around, the staff around the office perceive us. But if we think about it, if we're willing to be gossiping about other people, the reality is that other people are probably gossiping about us as well. And then sexual sin seems like, oftentimes like it's a pleasure we deserve, only to short circuit our closest relationships in the midterm and in the long term. Joseph's practice of the presence of God helps him see what he says in chapter 39, verse 9. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, he tells her, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against my master? Is that what he says? No, he says this. How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? And here's the reality. Sin is always, first and foremost, an offense against our holy God. Remember David in his agonizing psalm of confession, Psalm 51, after he commits adultery with Bathsheba. This is what he says in verse 4. He says, against you, referring to God, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. What he's really saying is he's not minimizing his offense of Bathsheba and Bathsheba's husband Uriah. What he's really doing here is he is magnifying the nature of his offense in his relationship with the God that he serves. If we think of our lives as being primarily under an overarching connection with God, then our relationship with him is our ultimate reality. It's our ultimate priority. We understand that he has both breathed life into us, and then he has also launched us into the world with an understanding of his expectations and his guidelines for life, which can be summed up really with two major expectations, 4 words: honor God and honor others, or love God and love others. And when we violate the second guideline about loving others, about honoring others, when we violate that guideline, we are always ultimately violating the first guideline more. Any employee who breaks company rules will, whether directly or indirectly, be held accountable to people at the highest level. At least in any well-run company, that should be the case, all right? And the reason for that is because they've disregarded what has been established by the highest authority in the company, and the violation ultimately reflects the most on those at the top. Joseph somehow understands this. He understands that an illicit relationship with this lady, no matter how short, no matter how seemingly harmless, does incredible damage with his relationship with his God, not to mention with his master. Remember, he has no Bible to teach him this. He doesn't have an advanced copy of the 10 Commandments that were not going to be given to Moses for another 400 plus years. But in his spirit, he is aware that sinning against his master is ultimately of great offense to God. So it says in verse 8 that he refused, but in verse 10, we read that she seduced him day after day. And it said that he refused, again, it says that he refused her advances, but the word translated refused in verse 10 is not the same word as in verse 8. It's really the most common word for hear, or the most common word for listen that we find in the Hebrew Old Testament. This is what I think the author is saying. He ignored her voice. He didn't let her words even enter his ears, his mind. It's like he put on noise-canceling headphones and totally tune her out. Contrast that with our common approach, or at least the common approach among some Christians, to temptations that face us in day-by-day living. How we approach sin and temptation oftentimes looks far different than what Joseph does in response to the temptation that is right in front of him. It's like men who leave themselves vulnerable to pornography on their phones by accessing websites that are just one tap, just one click away from all-out nudity on their phones. One click away from violating their wife's trust and bringing damage to the relationship that will take a long time to repair. It's like we oftentimes have this attitude regarding sin. How close can I get to the fire without experiencing or without suffering third-degree burns? There's another really hard principle in this chapter, and this one's troubling for me to share with you because I wish it wasn't the case, all right? But the reality is this: the presence of God does not make us immune from the painful consequences of other people's sins. Joseph, he does everything right in this story. I see no fault in his approach to his relationship with his boss, his interaction with his boss's wife. He resists sin more thoroughly and more effectively here than probably any other example that we find in Scripture. Because imagine what the conversation that he could have had with God later. I mean, really, God? This is what I get for taking the high road, for resisting all of her advances, for actually running away from sin, literally running away from sin, God. Why don't you protect me? And why don't you protect others when they do nothing wrong? For all of my admirable and honorable efforts here, my reward is now that I have to rot in prison? She is the one who lies. He's the one who pays the price. God doesn't step in because he is committed to honoring human autonomy. He is committed to honoring Potiphar's wife's human freedom and liberty. And I wonder could it be that a major reason that we chafe against that is because we are far more willing to manipulate others than we should ever be. And we wish God would do it as well. How come God just doesn't stop Potiphar's wife from lying to her husband about how Joseph didn't try to rape her, he tried to run away from her? Why doesn't God just stop that? Why doesn't God manipulate her mind and her words? We're comfortable with that, okay? Because we have tendencies to do that in our relationships with other people as well. Your obedience does not guarantee fair treatment from others. Because God loves other people too much to force them to choose the right behavior. He is more than willing to allow them the freedom to choose behavior that harms you or harms me. Remember, in these times, God balances the books at the end of our earthly lives, even though along the way things can look really, really unfair and very, very unbalanced. I have a few reflections about the presence of God as it pertains to trust, and then we'll wrap this up, all right? We see in this chapter that for both Potiphar and the warden of the prison, virtually everything important related to their jobs, they totally entrust to Joseph. Verse 6 says, so Potiphar left in Joseph's care everything he had. Verse 22 says, so the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. When we foster the presence of God in our lives, a natural fruit of that is often going to be that others will trust us. Now, granted, we have to have a certain measure of competency, all right, in which Joseph exemplified that he was more than capable of taking care of Potiphar's household first, more than capable of taking care of the jail, all right? Here's an example of what we shouldn't expect, okay? I mean, a foolish example, admittedly, all right? My wife, Nancy, works at the hospital. Her job there is to schedule patients for physical therapy. And each day that she goes into work, Nancy brings joy and compassion for the patients. She brings humor with the other staff. And in spite of the fact that I think my wife does the job very, very well, nobody yet at the hospital has entrusted her to perform hip surgeries. All right, so you have to have a certain level of competence. Okay, but I think the reality is when Nancy brings the presence of God in our lives, into the hospital, when we do that in our lives, the likelihood is that we're going to be entrusted by others. We're going to be entrusted by God with greater things. Our strongest relationships are always built on trust. And could I suggest to you that sometimes the evidence of that trust may not be immediately visible, because it's actually not seen easily here in the story, yet it's present here, and I want to explain. Remember who Potiphar is. We're told right away early in the chapter that Potiphar was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh. All right? So I think the best way to understand that is he's like the director of the Secret Service. All right? One of the most trusted individuals in the kingdom, responsible literally for the very life, the protection of the very life of Pharaoh. At least one author believes that Joseph worked for this Secret Service director for up to 11 years at this point in time when this story takes place, all right? There is clearly a significant track record of trust. Now, here's a historical tidbit that probably none of you are aware of, but ancient Egyptian historical records indicate that the punishment for rape, or the punishment even for attempted rape, was to be death. So if Joseph was accused of attempted rape, and obviously he was, then the question is, why wasn't he just executed? Why wasn't he put to death? More than one author that I read say that they believe that over the years of Potiphar gaining trust in his relationship with Joseph, Potiphar's relationship with his wife has eroded, and he has lost trust in that relationship. And so these authors surmise that Potiphar arranges for Joseph to avoid the death penalty because he seems to trust Joseph's moral character more than he actually trusts the word of his very own wife. In other words, they say he doesn't believe her story. I would imagine there might have been a little bit of marital friction between the two of them, if indeed that was the case. All right? So I would argue this. The presence of God in our lives does build trust, and sometimes that trust shields us from the very worst outcomes possible. And the worst outcome possible for Joseph, obviously, here would have been that he would have been executed. It almost certainly keeps Joseph off of death row. So, do not underestimate the importance of building trust in the potentially subtle ways that God may honor you for doing so. If you've trusted God, and it seems to have backfired, if you find yourself in a really hard place, not of your own choosing or of your own making, if you did everything right, but it seemed to have turned out wrong, can I encourage you to remember this? God hasn't finished balancing the books yet, and your trustworthy faith will still ultimately determine how things eventually sort out further down the road. And again, I look at this passage and I ask myself the question, okay, so what? Well, let me suggest a few practical steps of faith that we can take based on the principles that we've discussed today. The first is this: recognize that effectively resisting temptation long-term requires the presence of God's Spirit. I read this week, I thought this is a great quote, all right? Opportunity may only knock once, but temptation leans on the doorbell. You can't ignore it. It's going to be there. It's going to be front and center. And the more that we practice the presence of God, I think oftentimes the more that Satan tries to throw fuel into the fire to knock us off track. He has much more at stake the more that we are obedient and blessing people and blessing people in our world, all right? Our enemy is relentless in his efforts to destroy our lives, so vigilance cannot be a part-time commitment. A second application that I see here is this: don't let our instant culture seep into your expectations about God and when God should show up and reveal his presence. We are used to microwave ovens heating our food 5 times faster than they would on a stove. We're used to 5G speed on our cell phones. We are used to now receiving mail via email on our phones in the middle of a lake when we're out fishing. I don't think, though, that in a culture that we live in that has sped up so fast and where instant gratification has become our expectation, I don't think God has changed how he shows up based on that impatience. Building a lifetime of faith is the work of a lifetime of trust. So, the tidal wave of unrealistic expectations, of unbiblical expectations in our culture is always going to be in the direction of valuing immediate gratification instead of valuing ultimate contentment. One of those is from God, and the other definitely is not. There's great danger in ignoring this truth. Just because we live in a fast-paced world and God doesn't show up on our timetable, let's not come to the conclusion that God is to be faulted for that. Third, and this is just a repeat of something I've said, but I want to emphasize it again. Don't forget the simple truth that every sin you commit is first and foremost an offense before God. Your sin has injured God's heart more than anyone else's sin has injured yours. And finally, reflect on how interesting it is for Joseph to become a man of incredible trust that we see in this passage, when his earthly father Jacob was known for deception and untrustworthiness. So, if the family heritage that you have had handed to you doesn't include a godly example of trust, then there's no time like the present to start to begin establishing a different legacy, a God-honoring legacy, like a Joseph does here. It's like Abraham, major faults, and his son Isaac, major faults, and Jacob, extremely major faults, and that heritage gets totally changed by Joseph, who chooses the path of character, he chooses the path of integrity, and starts something new that's light years away spiritually and morally from so much of what he saw in his family history. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father God, I'm so grateful for this man, Joseph. He lived really, really well. He lived in circumstances that we can relate to, because we've all been faced with temptations that have seemed difficult for us. We've all wished for you to show up, and you haven't in our time frame. We've all been treated unfairly by others in spite of seasons of obedience in our own lives, and we have wondered, God, how come we don't get rewarded for that? How come it seems like we get punished for it? But I pray that we'd be able to see the big picture. I pray that we'd be able to see the big picture, God, so that when we are guilty of committing sins, we're able to see comprehensively that ultimately any sin against another person is first and foremost a sin against a holy God. And I pray that our hearts would just be broken by that. May we learn from the legacy that Joseph begins to establish, an example that eventually will get passed on to his sons. And may we find hope, God, that in this world that we live in, that has its difficulties and its frustrations, its temptations and its disappointments, that we don't have to be totally dominated by those things, but that we can turn our sights on you in obedience and faith and trust, determined to follow you no matter where, and have you begin a better, more godly legacy and heritage that we can pass on to others. It's my prayer for myself. It's my prayer for these, my brothers and sisters. And I pray it in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. Hey, thanks for joining us this week. I hope you have a wonderful week. Honor God, honor others. Amen.